Evening, everyone. I'm Tony Monaco, president of Tufts University, and it's my privilege to welcome you all virtually to Tufts and to Tisch College's Distinguished Speaker Series. We are honored to be joined today by Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg served as two-term mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and was a Democratic candidate for president of the United States in 2020. A graduate of Harvard University and an Oxford Rhodes Scholar, Mayor Buttigieg enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserve and became a lieutenant when he was deployed to Afghanistan in 2014. In April 2019, announced his candidacy for president, and in February 2020, won the Iowa Caucuses, becoming the first openly gay person to ever win a presidential primary or caucus. Today, Mayor Buttigieg leads Win the Era, a political organization that supports candidates at every level of government who are working to end division and build equitable, sustainable, and resilient communities. He and his husband, Chasen, live in South Bend with their two rescue dogs, Buddy and Truman. And joining Mayor Buttigieg in conversation today is Alan Solomon, the Pierre and Pamela Amidyar Dean of Tisch College. Dean Solomon is no stranger to politics and public service himself. In fact, his first job after graduating from Tufts was as a community organizer in Lowell, Massachusetts. A lifelong social and political activist, Dean Solomon previously served as the U.S. ambassador to Spain and Andorra under President Obama. He also chaired the bipartisan board of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service. Through leadership positions in the Democratic Party, Alan has served key roles in the presidential campaigns of Michael Dukakis, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, and Barack Obama. I would be remiss if I did not mention that this week, Dean Solomon announced his retirement, which will take place at the end of this academic year. While we will have many opportunities to sing Alan's praises in the coming months, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Alan, for your service and for your tremendous record of leadership at Tufts. For everyone in the audience, I hope you know that Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this fall. You can find more information and register for these events on the Tisch College website. Finally, to our students who are watching, if you have not already registered to vote, I encourage you to visit jumbovote.org to find out how you can register and how to request your absentee ballot this fall. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Alan Solomon and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Monaco. Thank you for your very kind words, and thank you for your leadership during this pandemic. And since you brought it up, let me just say, I'm not going anywhere until the end of June, so don't anybody treat me like a lame duck, because I ain't gonna quack. Before we begin, let me mention just a few things preliminarily. Today, Tufts University launched a new website, vote.tufts.edu. This is a one-stop shop for everything related to the 2020 elections, and it is available to the Tufts community and beyond. Let me also remind you, as President Monaco just did, to check out our entire series of speakers and events at the tischcollege.tufts.edu. You can find a schedule and register for our future events. Tomorrow, to mark Constitution Day, we will feature a program entitled The Loud Minority: Why Protests Matter in American Democracy. Our speaker will be Professor Daniel Gillian from the University of Pennsylvania. And later on in the semester, we have Van Jones, PBS White House correspondent, Yamiche Alcindor, Hank Azaria, Tufts alum, and many others. We hope to see you at subsequent events. But tonight, it's a great privilege and honor to welcome Pete Buttigieg. Welcome back to Massachusetts, Pete. I know you've spent some time here, and we're delighted to have you. I'm also pleased to say that we've had more people register for this event than ever before. And I guess your former colleagues at the Institute of Politics at Harvard, I guess, want to keep up with us because they have your husband Chasten speaking tomorrow evening. So in any event, let's get on with this. I think people are more interested in hearing from you than anyone else. Your interest in politics began at a very early age, but it seemed to flourish when you were a student at Harvard in the early 2000s. So tell us what attracted you to politics in the first place and how your college experience fueled that interest and led you to seek elected office.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Dean Solomon, for encouraging and inviting me to be part of this. And I've so enjoyed the opportunity to gather here, and also the work that, in particular, you and I have discussed that Circle is doing in terms of research that I think is really relevant in a lot of ways as we think about next generation politics. So I'm really flattered to be here, and appreciate President Monaco joining to kick off the program. And Harvard may have Chasten this week, but I've got you, and I'm really glad to be here. So thanks for the chance. And by the way, also just had a chance to meet some students from Fletcher and across Tufts, each of whom asked such intelligent questions. It's very encouraging for the road ahead. And of course puts me a little bit in a nostalgic frame of mind thinking about what it was like occasionally having the chance to ask questions as a student of practitioners, and having that chance, I think, helped nourish my own interest in politics and government. I even when I arrived in college, I was convinced that we were underestimating, my generation, which had fallen into kind of an ironic mode or fashion that I hope has kind of dissipated a little over the years. But we'd underestimated the importance of being engaged in politics, and in particular, the extent to which, if you feel like the system was warped or distorted or not working properly, that should be a reason all the more to be engaged and try to do something about it, rather than a reason to withdraw or retreat. And so, though I didn't grow up in a family that was politically connected in any way, I don't think I met any elected officials before I came to college. I did grow up politically aware. And when I reached college and had the chance to begin to understand through exposure to the people who ran the world that they might be very impressive people, they might be more intelligent than I was or more experienced, but they were not some different class of humans on a different plane of existence, that the world is run by people who are trying their best or trying in some way to get an outcome. I began to be able to envision myself as one of those people.
So you were elected mayor of South Bend, Indiana in 2012, and you served for 8 years. But with that as your only experience holding public office, may I ask respectfully, what gave you the chutzpah to seek the presidency of the United States?
Well, anyone running for the American presidency, I guess, reveals themselves to have some level of ambition and some regard for what they can bring. And I understood as the mayor of the more or less 250th largest city in the country, the skepticism. At the same time, one of the things I realized was that if I were the maybe 250th most senior member of Congress, there would have been less skepticism. And with all due respect to Congress, I was thinking about the fact that, there are even very senior senators in our country, depending on their previous experience, who never in their lives managed more than a few dozen people. And, each of us in public service, appointed or elected, gathers a certain perspective through that service. But I felt like the perspective of guiding a community through transformation, and especially a city like ours, which, despite the presence of a magnificent university that has us on the world map with Notre Dame, and in fact 5 colleges and universities here, we're actually a low-income community, characteristic of the so-called Rust Belt, and really feeling overlooked by politics in many ways, part of which led to the kind of reaction that propelled Donald Trump into office. And so I thought that perspective might actually be an asset compared to a more traditional level or type of federal experience, and felt like if we could get Washington running more like our better run cities and towns instead of the other way around, that might not be such a bad thing in a country that was clearly so fed up with the old normal that they were willing to elect a disgraced game show host to be the president of the United States.
Well, having asked you that question, you certainly outshone several much better known candidates, including for a while Vice President Biden. You really did electrify a great number of people. And Tell us what you attribute your appeal as a candidate. What was really special about your campaign and your voice that attracted the kind of interest that it did?
Well, I think we had the benefit of representing, first of all, just a radically different style from the current president, and there are different ways to do that, but I think our way really resonated. I think that precisely because we didn't emerge from Washington or even from a kind of established political circle, I think it gave us a sense of just being unconstrained by some of the patterns that had worn pretty thin with Americans and with voters and inside my party. I think folks were interested in a new generation stepping forward. And I think it also served us well to have knowing that I was pretty obscure at the beginning, a media strategy that had us everywhere from, CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, if they'd have me, to, TMZ, anywhere we could reach out and find somebody and make the case, we would. And I think when you added that all up to a kind of craving for something different and a searching for how we'd gotten to this place where a guy like this president could have come within shooting distance of the presidency, let alone win, I think just provoked an appetite for a different style of campaign. And that's very much what we were.
Well, I had occasion to meet a number of the people that were on your campaign, and I've been around presidential campaigns a fair amount. And I have to tell you, they were genuinely really nice people, and were accessible and respectful, and just lacked some of the other qualities that you sometimes find in that kind of an operation. So it was a wonderful reflection on the candidate, I have to say.
Thanks. That was important to us.
You were an early achiever. You were valedictorian of your class at St. Joseph's High School in South Bend. And in 2000, you were the winner of the first prize in the National Profile and Courage Essay Contest, which is held by the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library right here in Boston. The subject of your winning essay was the integrity and political courage of then U.S. Representative Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who was at the time one of only 2 independent politicians in Congress, may still be. Did you ever share your essay with Senator Sanders? And what was it like to run against one of your early political heroes?
Yeah, in fact, the last time I spoke with him, he was teasing me about that essay, and even at the time when I was a high school student, it came to the attention of his office, and I got a very gracious note. What caught my attention when I was in high school was this sense that people were trying to be what they were not in order to do well in politics. And he was different from that. And by the way, even though he and I have had our differences and have competed now, I still appreciate that quality, that what you see is what you get. And I wish we had more of that in official Washington and in our politics. So it was strange. I mean, many things about running for office for me were, especially being in the company that I was on that debate stage, were kind of an out of body experience. And I don't know which would have seemed more improbable. From the perspective of 1999, the idea of socialist Congressman Bernie Sanders mounting a credible campaign for the presidency, or my own. I think both would have seemed pretty laughable from that perspective. But I hope each of us made a contribution, even though neither of us came to be the nominee.
I think it's fair to say that each of you did. We are living in a period of multiple crises. Our national leaders seem powerless to address them on both sides of the partisan divide. The public's trust in politicians and even in our civic institutions is at a low point. How do you think we're going to go about restoring the public's trust in our public institutions, in our government, in our politics, and frankly, in our democracy?
That question of trust is something I think about all the time. Matter of fact, I'll have a book on the subject coming out in a few weeks. And I've looked into the sources of trust. And for better and for worse, the most enduring source of trust, I think, is predictable, beneficial behavior over a long period of time. Problem is, we don't have a long period of time. We don't have a long period of time for us to recover a level of political trust in our institutions here in the U.S. or globally, we don't have a lot of time to recover the level of trust that the U.S. Has among the peoples of the world, which, according to data fresh out from Pew, is at a frightening new low. And so we need to figure out not just how do you build trust, but how do you build trust in a hurry. Now, again, for better or for worse, historically, part of how you do that is in emergencies. So in the same way that individuals can build an amazingly deep amount of trust in a really short amount of time when they are, for example, in the military and on deployment because of the pressure of those circumstances. I would argue right now, faced with multiple moral, medical, and economic existential threats to the American project, from the issues brought to the fore in the anguish over racial injustice, to the pandemic, to the mounting crisis of climate change, for which the pandemic might come eventually to be remembered as a dress rehearsal. We've got a chance to consolidate our efforts together and rise to meet those challenges. I think in the doing of that work, there's actually an amazing opportunity for us to fashion that kind of trust, because we just plain have to. Much as a military unit thrown into a tough situation, it has to form trust in a hurry, not after, but before it is vindicated by experience under pressure. That's what we're going to have to do here, and much will depend on how quickly we can do it.
Well, I appreciate your optimism. And you mentioned your service in the military. You joined the U.S. Navy Reserve in 2009. In 2014, you took a 7-month leave to deploy, 7-month leave from your job as mayor to deploy to Afghanistan. You were part of a unit assigned to identify and disrupt terrorist finance networks. You were awarded the Joint Service Commendation Medal for your counterterrorism work. Why did you decide to join the military in the first place? And how did that experience inform your views as a public servant and then as a candidate?
Well, there was a tradition of service in my family on my mom's side. My father immigrated to this country in the 70s, but my mom's family went back quite a ways, and her father was a career military officer, retired as a colonel at Fort Bliss. And so I always felt a bit of a tug. But the thing actually that really put me over the edge was when I'd returned from Oxford, had always kind of vaguely wanted to serve, but never really walked the walk, and beginning to realize that I was maybe part of a problem. And the problem was that, for my grandfather's generation, service is what everybody had in common across different lines of class and privilege. It's where a young John F. Kennedy finds himself for the first time taking orders from the son of a farmer in, let's say, Indiana. And by the way, often, though its history is not perfect, often a much more racially integrated organization than most others at the time in the U.S. And yet, by the time of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it was almost a mark of class division whether you had anything to do with the military. And though I was never wealthy, I was conscious of a privileged education and could count on one hand the number of people I'd been at Harvard with who'd wound up in uniform. And I realized that I could either be part of that problem or I could be part of the solution. And so that helped put me over the edge and decide to get a reserve commission where I could continue the career that I had then in the private sector, but begin really making myself useful in some way. What I learned from it was the ability to form those kinds of connections of trust with people who had very different backgrounds, very different politics than mine. And especially in the case of the deployment, to recognize in people the qualities that you really want when someone's at your side in a frightening situation. And to be clear, I was not kicking down doors. I was not a special operations person, but part of my job was driving vehicles around Afghanistan. We went out the wire more than 100 times. We called it military Uber. And in those situations, forming and fashioning that kind of trust and dependency on other people is something I still think about a lot in terms of what service, not necessarily military, could mean for all of us here at home as we're trying to rebuild that kind of social capital.
I wanted to ask you about this. As earlier was mentioned earlier, I served on the board of the Corporation for National Community Service, and you put out quite a robust service plan during your campaign for civilian national service. Yeah. And I actually was quite impressive. Could you talk a little bit about what your vision was and is for engaging more young people in some type of service, whether it's military or civilian national service.
Yeah, the idea was to meet all of these challenges that we know we have, and if you look at the acceptance rates of the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, the military, they're consistently below 1 in 4, 1 in 5. So there are way more Americans who would serve given the chance than actually get to do it. Mm-hmm. And you couple that with the work that needs to be done. I envisioned a climate corps that could help with things like weatherizing homes, a community health corps that could help confront the crises of addiction and mental health that don't only require the intervention of people with medical degrees, but others who can be trained to perform really important roles. And even an intergenerational corps based on the idea that people of all generations need to connect better and have a lot to offer, but set it up in a way that it could become kind of an expectation. You don't have to force it on anybody, but get it to where, and make sure it's paid so it's not a luxury either. So it's just, when you're applying for your first job or you're applying for college, you get that question: where'd you serve? What was your service like? And it becomes something we all had in common. That was the vision. And I'm still hopeful that it can happen. Senator Chris Coons and others in the Senate have a bipartisan bill to do this. And as you know from your leadership role at CNCS, we already have the plumbing, that we already have mechanisms like AmeriCorps, that if we just turned up the dial of how much was appropriated into them, could have millions more Americans serving. Mm-hmm. And at a time when we need more people doing things from repairing our infrastructure to contact tracing in the wake of the coronavirus, I think that the case for service has only grown more compelling since I was out there beating the drum for it as a candidate 6, 10, 12 months ago.
Well, hopefully that drumbeat will continue and even grow louder. A lot of people are anxious about the upcoming elections. I wonder if you could just share your thoughts about what worries you the most about November 3rd, or the situation, just trying to hold this election under the circumstances that we are faced with.
Well, I am worried. I'm worried about efforts at voter suppression. I'm worried about foreign misinformation. I'm worried about one simple and actually solvable problem, which is a potential shortage of poll workers. This is really important for young people to hear, because there's this presumption that poll workers are all retirees, and by and large they have been, but for obvious reasons that's a problem in the COVID era. And in addition to some of the more nefarious things going on, especially impacting communities of color, one simple reason why there may not be as many polling sites open as there should be this year is a simple lack of poll workers. So it's a bit like jury duty. I mean, it's not sexy, but it's a big way that any individual could make a difference. And I hope more people consider signing up to do that.
Yeah.
I'm closely following the work of Democracy Docket and Mark Elias, and the work of Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams' organization, which my own organization called Win the Era has teamed up with, to try to make sure that we're heading off any of these efforts of voter suppression, because almost any time the system could choose kind of A or B, it seems to always choose some default, which makes it harder for people of color, poor people, people with many jobs, and young people to vote, all of whom are groups, of course, who are more likely to vote for my party. Yeah. Now, I have a separate worry that I think is just as important, which is that legitimate election results will be attacked, and that the legitimacy of the elections themselves may be undermined, especially by a president who has already said either he wins or it was rigged. There's no other possibility. A bizarre thing for any president to say, but certainly an unpopular one like the current president. And so we need to also prepare the public for the reality that it may take a couple days for us to get results. And having gone through what we went through in Iowa, where I didn't find out for sure that I had won the Iowa caucuses until weeks later, I can very much relate to the sense of urgency in wanting results now. Mm-hmm. But if it takes us a couple days because they're carefully counting absentee ballots in Pennsylvania, let's say, we should not allow that to become ammunition for those who would undercut the credibility of our American election system.
Yeah. If I can mention or put an exclamation point on the need for poll workers. One thing people may not be aware of is that in some states, you don't have to be old enough to vote in order to be a poll worker. And actually, we've done some research. My colleagues at Circle have done some research on the benefits of having young people as poll workers, and how that, especially poll workers who look like some of the people in the communities who are coming to the polls, and how that the impact that has on the likelihood that people will turn out.
Mm.
You know, we're not born with sort of the skills of casting a ballot, and Lord knows we don't make it very easy for people, especially young people. And having poll workers who can relate to other young people has been proven to be really, really useful. I do want to ask you something that a lot of my friends and colleagues in this part of the country have asking themselves, and I don't want to get into too much partisanship, but we have seen behavior on the part of this current president that is, to say the least, unprecedented. And in the eyes of many, it actually degrades the office of president itself. And yet he consistently retains the support of a significant portion of the electorate, certainly in the 40s. And, you know, the polls, you know, wax and wane. Now, Massachusetts is a pretty blue state that voted for Hillary Clinton almost 2-1. But your home state of Indiana was almost the reverse and voted for Trump by more than 2-1. So explain to us Easterners, you know, some of the, you know, reasons that people are drawn to his candidacy and some of the things that we need to know that we need to address.
Well, there are a lot of things that drive this. You know, one is really separate from ideology, just a sense that at least he's talking to us. Something that I think our party has worked out ways to overcome this time around by really going everywhere and engaging with different kinds of communities. But there are places that I think were written off as red states or conservative communities that just didn't hear much of a democratic message. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's no discussing the Trump phenomenon without talking about the racial anxieties that he spoke to, and that's real and needs to be confronted and overcome in a way that I think can be done without ever watering down the urgency of racial justice, and yet giving some people, let's call it, psychological room to evolve to a better place. Because a lot of these things are better explained, frankly, by psychology than they are by political science. Mm. And then there's the fact that people are getting information in very different ways. Many people simply live in a community, an information ecosystem, a church, a family, where voting Republican, no matter what, has been synonymous with just being respectable for a very long time. Now that's starting to break up because of this president's words and actions that I think are as offensive to traditional conservative values as they are to progressives. But still, it's hard to break that kind of habit, and especially true for those who are in a different media environment, living on a different field of fact. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important to penetrate any of those bubbles that people may be in. It's why I'm getting to be a regular on Fox News. In fact, about an hour, I'll be doing it again. I'll draw the line at certain opinion hosts that I think are on in bad faith. But even if I think a network is sometimes acting in bad faith, so long as some viewers are watching in good faith, then I think we have an obligation to get a different message across. And I think that the more we do that, the more we can reach people who nowhere is it written in stone that they can only vote one way. And so shame on us if we don't at least attempt to bring them to our point of view.
So we have a number of students who want to ask questions, but I'm going to ask one last one, if I may. 20 years ago, you could have been in this audience listening to an inspiring young leader that young people could probably identify with. And so I want to give you an opportunity to speak to this evening's audience, which is not exclusively, but by and large students. And what message would you like to convey to them about participating in our democracy, about their, not only their responsibility, but the opportunities for them to really make a difference, or, you know, the opportunities in public service? And I'd love to give you the opportunity to speak to them, if I may.
Let me start with the good news about the bad news. So I know you didn't ask to be in university at a moment when one of the basic functions of a university, which is convening, has been, at least in its traditional form, defeated. And we've had to innovate and create new ways to do it. and you didn't ask to be coming of age into a nearly catastrophic economic freefall, a moment of confrontation with our country's inability to live the truth that Black Lives Matter, nor the collapse in global respect for this country, let alone a once-in-a-century public health crisis. So that's all obviously daunting. But the other side of that is that you will not have to wonder whether yours will be a consequential generation. This is one of those moments. You're coming of age into one of those moments that will be studied and written about and thought about for generations. And I'm convinced that, within that kind of era is a hinge point that we're at literally right now, as in this fall, that will set the tone for what I believe will be the deciding decade of this century, the 2020s, which will in turn, I think, really set up how American and perhaps global life unfolds for the balance of our lifetimes. So no pressure, but the stakes couldn't be higher. And your role, not only as and when you are in positions of responsibility, as you are now training to be, but even right now, as people with voices in this country, as activists, advocates, organizers, thinkers, voters. Also with this enormous privilege of having it be your full-time job to learn as much as you can about yourself and the world and how it all works before you jump into it in a different way, gives you a level of power that I hope you can feel and be conscious of, because those stakes are rising to an almost unimaginable level. And so those translate into high stakes, even in your studies, as well as in your futures. And hopefully that is propulsion and motivation for you that can compensate for the obvious frustrations and deprivations of being in this moment that you're in. This is a moment of enormous consequence, and your consequential contributions to it don't have to wait until you get yourself hired or elected or appointed to some formally responsible role.
Well, I don't think that just this generation will feel pressure. I think they're actually highly motivated to participate. And just to cite a couple of poll findings in some of our work, 83% of the young people that we polled back at the beginning of June said that they believe that their generation can change this country. And 79% said that this pandemic has taught them about the importance of politics in their daily lives. So that is probably promising, and
Good.
we can take part. So I now want to call on students to ask questions, and I see we have Elizabeth. If you would each give us your name, if you would, in the school that you're in and your year, and then ask a question. And of course, remember the questions end with a question mark.
Hello, my name's Elizabeth. I am a parent of a young man in the School of Arts and Sciences. My question for Mayor Pete: how can Democrats bring back the rural voter to the party?
Great question, because I think the urban-rural divide is one of those that's really straining our country, and I don't think it has to be. I mean, part of it from a policy perspective is maddening. You look at the dairy bankruptcies that are going on, especially, but not only in Wisconsin. You look at what was happening to anybody in soybeans during the China trade war under this president. You look at the simple fact that one of the best cases for some form of public health care, whether you believe in a public option or Medicare for all, is what it's like to be a farmer. And that's just the ag part, right? And a lot of rural Americans aren't directly involved in agriculture, but are living in communities that, among other things, suffer because of the loss of rural health care due to refusal to expand Medicaid in some states, and the failure of this country to fully expand all forms of infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, at a time when we more and more live and work online. So there's a lot of reasons why my party ought to have a great message for rural Americans. We just got to get out there and do it. And it's been a focus of mine. And I think it means being willing to go into places that we might not win right away to kind of chip away. To go into counties that we might be used to losing 80-20, see if we can't make it 60-40. Because over time, that's not only how you win in statewide races, for example, but also how you let that person who maybe thinks at coffee after church that they're literally the only Democrat at the table, to speak up enough for two other people who feel the same way to realize that they weren't alone either. And that's the real meaning of a kind of 50-state strategy that I think we need. So part of it's policy, part of it's tone, letting people know we don't, that this is not going to be a party that looks down on anybody. And part of it's a refusal to allow the current kind of physical forces to continue. I think of it this way. It's nowhere written that the more socially progressive party can also be the one for rural America. It's just sort of worked out that way lately. It worked out that way in a different fashion 80 years ago with the parties reversed, right? Then the Democratic Party was really the party of the worker and the farmer, but was also home to a lot of the most racist and nativist elements in American politics. We don't want to go back to those being your only two choices. And so it's a great, at this moment of political realignment where voters of faith are looking around saying, wait a minute, like this president holding up the Bible, has he opened it? At a time when military families are saying, wait a minute, this, I've always voted Republican because I thought that was national security vote, but this is not my president. And similarly, I think rural families, and especially those in agriculture, there's a moment for a once in a generation scrambling of tribal habits. And I think that's a very good thing.
Great. Mark is up next. Is Mark?
Hello.
Oh, here you go.
My name is Mark. I'm from the
Mark.
Tufts School of Arts and Sciences. I'm a sophomore. My question is a little similar to Dean Solomon's, but I'm still curious. How has your experiences serving in the U.S. Navy abroad affected your foreign policy stances here in America?
Well, thanks, Mark, for the question. One thing that I think back to constantly is the awareness of how the level of trust in the U.S. actually works on the ground. So you could sort of feel out there, at least I did, that, one of the things that kept me safe was my body armor and the person in the vehicle next to me and my equipment. But another thing that kept me safe was the fact that the flag on my shoulder symbolized a country that was viewed as keeping its word. And that was something that had an effect on our allies. It was something that had an effect on our Afghan partners. And it was something that had an effect on our adversaries. And that is part of the kind of almost moral armor that is at risk right now, and that really does, in concrete ways, keep Americans safe overseas and ultimately keep us safe here. I learned about the risks people take, even being seen near us. All the way down to the guy who cleaned the office as a contractor, who, I was trying to learn Dari, and he would teach me sayings in Dari. And we wound up connecting a little bit over the subject of corn, because I'm from Indiana and he's from a part of Parwan province where they grow a lot of corn. But learning how endangered his family was in his village if word got out that he was working with the Americans, and thinking about that obligation we have to do right by those who take a chance to work at our sides because they think it's the right thing to do for their country. All of that's shaped my view that American leadership really is needed in the world right now, but it can't be just any America. We got to be our best. But America at its best, I still believe, is a force that's needed more than ever. And that's something that my time serving only reinforced for me.
Thank you. David, unmute yourself.
David, you're a master's student at the school. And as someone who is still trying to figure out what they want to do when they get out of school, I wanted to ask you, what motivated you to move from working in the private sector, consulting with McKinsey, to public service in politics and the military?
So I joined McKinsey because I felt like there was something missing in my formation. To be honest, my education, my agenda there was largely educational. I needed money too. I needed a paycheck because I've been a student or a campaign worker most of the time. And I knew it was time to start saving up. But I don't think I would have taken the job if I didn't think it would fill a gap in just how I understood the world. I understood it academically. But I want to really understand how people and money and goods move around the world and how the private sector works. And I would say that largely that promise was kept in terms of the value for me of having that work experience. The other side of it, though, was that it reminded me of the difference in motivation and purpose that you get when you work on something with public implications. And there was one particular moment where I'd just been spending all day analyzing grocery prices. It's very intellectually interesting work, but at a moment I got up to get a cup of coffee and I just had this kind of moment where I thought, I don't care. And the moment that thought crosses your mind, in my case, it was a sign that client service wasn't for me. But whatever you're doing, if that thought crosses your mind and you are in a position to make a change, it's probably time to find something that makes you tick, especially if you have the great privilege of having access to work that will sustain you financially and also mean something to you in terms of public purpose. But I think there's a lot to be said for working outside of the field that you think is your center of gravity. As long as you're ready for the risk that you might take on the values of a world you're going into more than you meant to. And so just remembering what center, I mean, there's nothing wrong, I suppose, with evolving as you learn more about how the world works. But any place you go, any campaign or company or think tank or school of thought, any workplace you're in, you're gonna find yourself absorbing what's around you, caring about the things that the people around you care about. And so at the comparatively tender moment that you're in professionally, I think it's actually worth thinking about not only what you want, but what you want to want. And not to get too meta on you, but think about the fact that wherever you're about to go will shape not only your skills, but your preferences.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Eula, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right.
It's okay. Hi, I'm Eula, and I'm a recent class of 2020 graduate from the History and Museum Studies program here at Tufts. And my question is, how do you see the challenges caused by the COVID pandemic in the 2020 elections affecting elections and voting practices long term?
Well, the optimistic view is that certain things that were due to be overcome or abandoned because they were really arcane and antiquated, that this will push them over the edge. Certain paper-based things will just never do again and we may need paper trails for security, but certain processes involving forms in triplicate can be abandoned for something better. Campaigning, I think some forms of campaigning will snap back to the way they were after the pandemic, and some won't. Yesterday I did a get out the vote and phone bank kickoff in Iowa, sitting right here. And there's some power in that, even though we've also, I think, all learned through Zoom the ways in which Zoom is just not the same, right? But I think we have a more sophisticated understanding of what you can and can't do in terms of building social capital and getting work done in this way versus in other ways. I think the jury's still out. I mean, part of how we're going to find out is seeing which states conducted elections most effectively and which campaigns most successfully campaigned compared to their competitors. And then we'll learn from that. But my hope is that we'll get to a place that's more participatory, that does not have some of the narrow selection biases of, for example, the narrow set of the sorts of people who have the time and inclination to show up at a certain kind of public meeting in local government versus the total range of people impacted. But, first do no harm. And we've got to make sure that this is not just opening windows for different kinds of nefarious activity, especially in the form of suppression. We should also not be afraid to learn from countries that have done a lot more with secure online voting. We're not there in the US, and you would have to know that it's absolutely secure, or at least more secure than what we do now, which is 99.999% secure. But we should learn from what others are doing so that whatever we graduate into is not just more safe, but also more representative than what we've been doing. Because we shouldn't give ourselves, even though the US is the most consequential democracy, probably since Athens, that still doesn't mean that we've got it figured out or that we're even fully worthy of the term right now. We got some work to do.
Great. Ishan, it's next. Or is it Brianna? I'm not sure. I'm looking at my screen. Whoever's next, Here we go.
Here's Ishan.
Hi, my name is Ishan, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Engineering. As college students, figuring out where our passions lie and what we want to do for the rest of our lives are questions that we face every day as we're learning more about ourselves and the ever-changing world around us. My question is, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would that be?
Well, one thing is don't worry too much about the title you're about to have, because it's going to be a strange, winding road to what you're trying to do. The more you can focus on the impact you're hoping to have or the space you're trying to contribute in versus the specific role you think you want to get, the better, right? And a simple example of that would be, if someone in my position in 2002 had said, I want to be a presidential candidate at the age of 37, what you probably wouldn't have done, especially as a young, closeted, gay American, is move home to Indiana, run for state treasurer, get massively defeated, turn around, become the mayor of your city, and then in your 8th year mount a national campaign, right? Like, that's not one of the things you piece out if you're thinking of this in terms of chess moves. But what I did do was kind of follow a sense of what I cared about and what I wanted to work on and where I wanted to make a difference, and found that it led me, like this kind of North Star, to a chance to make a lot of impact and to work on things that I cared about in ways that were energizing. I think it's worth remembering that you're always going to be better at things that you care about. And so always break a tie in terms of working on things that matter to you more. And that you can't overstate the importance of the people you're going to be around. And so another way to settle a tough decision about, do I go this way or do I go that way, is to think about it a little more in terms of who than what. And that'll, I think, serve you well. And then the last, and this is easier said than done, is not to worry so much about whether you're making the right move at each point in time, especially in your 20s, you are in the enviable position of being able to afford to blow a couple of years on a path that turned out not to be for you. That's a perfectly good way to spend some amount of time, is to try something and find out that it didn't really work. That's how you learn what you really do care about. And so I don't mean to say the stakes are not high, but there's some flexibility in this path. And you meet some people and they're just a bullet train and they're going to be what they're going to be, and they've got every step figured out. And if that's you, more power to you. But if it's not, don't worry about it, as long as you know where you want to really have an impact.
Thank you.
Brianna's up next. Brianna?
Hi, my name is Brianna, and I'm a rising junior at Tufts studying IR and Econ. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I'm lucky to have been raised by a really strong single mother who instilled values of love and acceptance for all people. Unfortunately, not all of my family members share the same values. How do you suggest beginning this important dialogue with family members and friends who do not share the same values in reference to the Black Lives Matter movement, the seriousness of COVID-19, and the climate crisis, among other issues? How do we bridge this gap and find common ground and work towards a better future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Brianna, I think you're wise to think about this from the family level up, as well as from the kind of political or media level down, right? Because these divisions are actually playing out in our families and our communities and in our relationships. And that's actually, I think, where the salvation is going to come from, because the benefit you have with a member of your family is you know something about them besides their politics. If somebody goes by and all I know about them is that they're wearing that red hat, I'm going to feel very strongly about them right away. Even though I don't know anything about how kind they are to their spouse or how quick they would be to help somebody in their immediate circle or who crossed their paths as a stranger in need. So you've already got something to grab hold of. And that means you know the values that you do share. And they may not be public or social values. They may be interpersonal values about hard work or how people ought to treat each other. But there's always something, right? And I think it's always best to try to build from that. What I found frustratingly is, amassing all the evidence you think is convincing and shoving it in the face of somebody who doesn't agree with it. It's just, you've tried it at Thanksgiving, right? It isn't always effective. If anything, they might respond to it by just finding the evidence to be, for some reason, something they'll dismiss out of hand. But if you can build on the things that you do value and then help people see how that's at stake, especially when it comes to, for example, with the movement of Black Lives, I think there is a sense among some people that this involves something being unfairly taken from you. That accommodating the expectations of those who are crying out for equality involves somehow being robbed. And nothing could be further from the truth. This isn't to deny that certain forms of privilege need to be laid aside or even given up. But of course, a lot of people don't think of themselves, a lot of working class white people in particular don't think of privilege as their own experience, even though it's inescapably part of the racial dynamics of this country. But trying to move past this idea of something being encroached on and toward this idea of what we're building together and this expectation of dignity that we all ought to be able to have, and the simple fact that people are hurting. And if you can't understand all of the reasons why, you can at least understand that it's a reality. That, at least for me, that's where I find I can get more traction, and grabbing hold of something that is there. For some people, it's faith. For some people, it's work ethic. For some people, it's just love of a person. I mean, this certainly meant a lot for the queer community, right? That people sometimes loved somebody before they realized that they were a member of this minority. And so it opened a different path than is available in some of these other conversations. That's, I think, our best shot at doing this. And I'm glad you're mindful of this at the family level, because it's going to have to come from the bottom up, no matter how many times people like me go on Fox.
Thank you. We have, I think, two more questioners. Well, we have many more questioners. I think we have time for two more. Sylvia?
Hello, good evening, Dean Solomon and Mayor Pete, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity. I am a Fletcher alumni, and I am currently a Mexican diplomat. I work for the Mission of Mexico to the UN. So I am very close to Fletcher, although I'm sad not to be able to visit as much as I would like to. Mayor Pete, I would like to ask you about what you think regarding the worrisome issue that the US is possibly the only developed nation without universal health care. And why do you think it is, in my view, wrongly classified or considered a socialist policy?
Yeah. Well, we got into our healthcare system on a very strange path-dependent means, right? Having to do largely with employers trying to distinguish themselves during a period of wage controls 2 years ago. Nothing you would ever invent from scratch, and yet it's brought us to this point. I think the word socialism has been thrown around so much as a way to knock down really any policies proposed toward a more robust social democracy that it's almost lost all its meaning. And that could be useful now that it has increasingly lost its meaning, especially for a generation that, wasn't around to be formed by the Cold War, and this knee-jerk assumption that socialism and communism were the same thing and go here, and capitalism and democracy were the same thing and go here. Now, I think a newer generation is more alive to tension between capitalism and democracy, as well as differences between socialism and communism. And that opens this window. When it comes to healthcare, I think that, the reality is we are the only developed nation that hasn't figured out a way to do this. And at risk of sounding a little nationalist, I don't think Americans should settle for that. I don't think a country like America should be satisfied with that. And it's one of the many reasons why we need to resolve it, whether it's in the way that I proposed, which effectively creates an opportunity for public health care for everybody, but leaves intact a private option, or any of the other approaches that people have proposed. But we know what we have doesn't work. And people get that. That's the good news. People definitely get that where we are doesn't work. Consider the political trajectory of the Affordable Care Act, which was politically lethal for Democrats the first time I was running for office in 2010. And within the space of less than a decade became the winning issue for my party. So much so that the president has to deny his own position on this. That is a good sign. I mean, it's frustrating, but it is also a sign of great progress, because it means when we did the policy and it worked, people liked it, it was politically rewarded eventually. That's, I think, what kind of lights the way forward. All kinds of further analysis can go into how we got here. Again, I think it's probably impossible to separate from a lot of racial politics in this country to really understand how we reached this point without it being available. But more importantly, I think we have a moment on our hands at last when we can establish that this is a basic expectation that people in this country or any country ought to be able to have, and craft a uniquely American way to do it.
Andrew, I think you'll have the last, you won't have the last word, but you'll have the last question.
Thank you, Dean Solomon, and hi, Mayor Buttigieg. I'm a really big fan, and welcome
Thanks,
to Virtual Tufts. I'm currently a junior here, and I'm a political science major at the School of Arts and Sciences. And as a debater myself, I found some of the arguments during the primaries to be extremely interesting. My personal favorite is when during the Las Vegas primary, Senator Klobuchar criticized you for not having enough Washington experience. You responded by reversing that argument by stating that an outside perspective is necessary to break down the elitism of Washington, and that you don't have to be in Washington to matter. But this brings up a very difficult dilemma. You don't want Washington to be exclusively full of elitists who could afford qualifications like higher education and have extensive political connections. But at the same time, you want candidates to be educated and have experience. Do you think that the current balance that candidates strike now is satisfactory, or do you think that the qualifications for running for office must be reformed?
What a great and profound question. I think it depends whether, when you say qualifications, we're talking about the kind of formal qualifications, which are of course pretty minimal, or the qualifications that we hold in our mind, right? Which are the ones that are actually more likely to be enforced. And yet, as I discovered, you can break those up, or at least press them a little bit, right? The fact that I obviously didn't win, but the fact that my candidacy eventually was taken seriously and did win one state shows that we were able to break down this idea that you have to have accumulated your public service experience in this way, right, for it to count. And, you know, if nothing else, that the fact that the president of the United States is a disgraced game show host tells you, you know, just how much those expectations can be blown up. Although in that case, in my view, not in a good way. I think ultimately the most important thing is to have a really diverse range of experiences that lead to people being in office. And I think that's happening more and more. It's not just like, okay, graduate, lawyer, local legislator, state legislator, federal legislator, right? You know, there are candidates there's a candidate for legislature in Washington who's formerly incarcerated, who is using that as one of the reasons why she ought to be elected, because that experience means something in making policy on the criminal legal system. There are candidates who draw on their experience of racial exclusion, including sometimes in majority white districts, as part of the basis for why they're equipped to meet this moment and ought to be elected. And so not just professionally, but in terms of life experience, I think it's become more acceptable to bring that range of experiences forward. And I think that's a great thing. Look, predictably, Senator Klobuchar and I were each making the case for our respective set of strengths and the things that we brought to the table, each of which was legitimate, but for the reasons we litigated, maybe had different weight, depending how you think of it. But I'd say at the end of the day, anybody who meets the legal qualifications ought to be given a shot. And anybody who can show how whatever their experience is meets the moment and bears on the problems in front of us deserves to be taken seriously. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that's great timing. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think we could continue this conversation for quite some time. There's several dozen questions in the Q&A boxes that are fascinating. We're not going to get to them. I want to thank you, Pete, for joining us. This was really, I think, a highlight for many of us. Really enjoyed the conversation and also the opportunity to ask so many questions. You one of the few people I've met in this business who knows how to give a short answer or not too long an answer. And in any event, I want to just I noticed when I looked at questions, we have a lot of alumni who have tuned in tonight, some parents, and I just want to welcome all of you to our future events. Again, go to tischcollege.tufts.edu and look at the schedule. But I hope we can stay in touch. I think that your service in so many different ways is just a model for young people, and for that matter, even for old people like me. So thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you.
Thanks to my colleagues for putting this together, and give them hell on Fox News.
Sounds good. What an honor to be with you. I have such high regard for you and for this institution. So I'm delighted to be with you virtually, and can't wait till I can be there in person.
We look forward to it. Thank you very much.